So I'm just going to start by giving a very quick overview of the current electronic road pricing system in Singapore. Then I'm going to go a bit into the political and social context which led to the development of road pricing systems in Singapore. Talk a bit about the next generation road pricing system, which is based on satellite navigation. That's going to replace our current system over the next few years. And then I'll talk a bit about the performance of the current system in terms of the economic effects and what we need to know in the future in order to unlock the potential of the next generation system. Okay, so okay, maybe just a few basic facts about the current electronic road pricing system. It's been in place since 1998. You can see an example of the road pricing gantries we have on the left-hand side in the photo. And, so the way it works is all vehicles in Singapore have an onboard unit which is mandatorily installed. You drive underneath the gantry, it detects your presence, and it levies the charge automatically based on the time of day and the type of vehicle you're driving. And the charge schedules are set in advance. Everybody knows what they are, and they're adjusted quarterly to maintain optimal performance in the roads. And I go a bit later into what that means. So the current network has about 93 of these gantry units throughout the island. So Singapore is an island city-state, about 5.5 million people, very dense and very built up. On the map on the right, you can see the current location of those gantries. So there are really two types of pricing systems. We have point-based systems, which are located at the major expressways and arterial roads. And they just charge the vehicle for passing through them, and they're used to control congestion during the morning peak mostly. And then on the lower right-hand side, that's where the historic city center is, and the gantries there are mostly forming the cordon around the city center, as well as the main shopping district. And that's our cordon-based pricing. And that's actually the heart of the original system, which started way back in 1975 to charge people for entering the central business district. Okay, so here's a bit of the context as to how this all came about. So this chart shows you vehicle growth in Singapore since independence, which was in 1965, and some of the major policy developments since then. And I think the main takeaways from this are, Singapore actually started as a fairly developing country at independence in 1965. Vehicle ownership and penetration wasn't very high back then. You can see the total vehicle count, about 200,000 vehicles. That's about 100 vehicles per 1,000 population. Of that, for private cars, it's around only about 50 private cars per 1,000 population back at independence. But there was very rapid economic development after independence. And as a result of that, there was a lot of pressure to do something about congestion. And so the government embarked on various vehicle restraint schemes throughout the last 5 or 6 decades, starting with the area licensing scheme, which is a cordon-based pricing scheme in 1975, moving on to vehicle quotas, that's ownership caps where you have to essentially buy the right to own a vehicle in Singapore. Then there was road pricing in 1995, that was the forerunner of the charges on major expressways and so on. Electronic road pricing in 98, and then in the next couple of years, we are going to switch over to a GNSS-based road pricing system. So something which is not shown in this chart is actually the rapid economic growth of Singapore. We started out with a per capita income, or GDP rather, sorry, of about $500 in 1965. That's gone up to 22,000 US dollars in 1998 when we had road pricing, electronic road pricing introduced. And today it's north of 60,000 US dollars. So you can imagine with that huge increase in income, there's a lot of demand to own cars, and that's something that policymakers have had to manage. Okay. Yeah, so in the early years, the main policy objective was really to deal with the underfunded and disorganized public transport system in Singapore. The road infrastructure was inadequate, there was rapid economic growth, so most of the policy was really about providing better public transport, road expansion, supporting development. But as I mentioned earlier, in 1975, the area licensing scheme was introduced as a means of trying to curb congestion in the city center to enable public transport services to run more efficiently. And after that went into place, for the next couple of decades, the scheme was revised and expanded, and car ownership was actually curbed through increasingly heavy taxes and fees. And around this time, we also started developing our metro system. Now, in 1990, we introduced the vehicle quota scheme, and that actually followed a Parliamentary Select Committee on Land Transport Policy. And that committee was charged with two objectives, well, many objectives, but these are the two key ones for our purposes. The first was to examine the need for measures to curb road usage and the effectiveness and appropriateness of measures currently enforced. That referred to the area licensing charges. And the second point was to examine current policies for controlling the population of motor vehicles. And that referred to heavier and heavier taxes to try to discourage people from buying cars. So I won't read this in detail, but this is an extract from the report of the Select Committee on Land Transport Policy, and the key points are actually underlined over here. The first key point is that the committee, after taking evidence, talking to people and holding meetings, they concluded that vehicle usage restraints, that means road pricing, they concluded that road pricing was considered more politically costly than ownership restraints, which is purchase taxes, quotas, and other ways of charging you for just owning a car. And that's a very important insight because they figured that when people are forced to pay $2 or $3, whatever it is, for using the car on a daily basis, they're apt to remember that and respond to that with, more animus towards policymakers compared to paying a large amount upfront or otherwise fighting for the right to own a car upfront. So that's one point. The second point, which is very important, is that vehicle usage restraints actually can balance, in a way, vehicle ownership restraints, which is to say, if you apply road pricing correctly, you reduce demand for usage of roads in the most congested areas of the city, and that allows you to sustain a larger overall vehicle population while maintaining a given level of congestion. That's a very important point, because combining these two insights led to the policy which has more or less guided a lot of our expansion of road pricing from the 90s onwards, which is a carrot and stick policy. And it means the following. Expanded vehicle ownership is something that the population wants, and that's the carrot. But that has to be balanced with road user charges, which have to be expanded to keep congestion at an acceptable level. And I have to say, one thing which the government achieved back then was to focus the public's attention on the need to, was to focus the public's attention, or rather to get the public to accept the need to control congestion and vehicle ownership in some way. So the government managed to get the public to agree that some kind of restraint in vehicle ownership was necessary in order for people to be able to actually use their cars and get somewhere. And because of that, generally speaking, public attention is now focused on the trade-offs between different vehicle restraint policies. Very few people actually question the need for any kind of vehicle restraint policy at all. And that's I think that's quite important for understanding how policymakers in Singapore have been managing to convince the public to do this. Okay, so the vehicle quota scheme. So just briefly, what it does is it actually gives the government full control over vehicle growth rates, which they attempted to control in the past by just increasing taxes, but that was really suboptimal. So to own a vehicle in Singapore, you have to buy a certificate of entitlement at auction. It allows you to register a car for 10 years. It goes along with the car so it can be transferred to a second owner or whatever. And you need a new one if you want to keep your car after 10 years. Now, problem with this scheme was, you can expect it actually created a lot of upwards pressure on vehicle prices or on quota prices. That's because in high demand years, the price for one of these certificates of entitlement to own a car has actually been several times annual income. So you can imagine what kind of political uproar that causes. And that just further reinforced the political importance of selling road user charges to the public as a way of getting expansions in the vehicle growth rate. Okay, and that came out in the debate when Parliament decided to enable electronic road pricing in 1998. So this is a quote from the Minister for Communications then. And the point he makes is, as the roads become less congested, we can review our vehicle quotas and, if feasible, release more COEs. So the government was well aware that the public had an insatiable demand to own cars, and this is an example of the application of the carrot and stick policy. We're going to expand road pricing. We all know the public doesn't like that, but we're going to tell you it's for your own good, because once we do it, we can let you buy more cars. That's the idea here, okay? And to ease introduction of the electronic road pricing scheme, the rates were initially set below that of the area licensing scheme, which it replaced. And vehicle taxes were also restructured and lowered as part of this. So what we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s was actually a policy shift from ownership towards usage-based restraints. This can be seen in the quote from the Ministry of Transport on the new term of Parliament in 2005. Right, so the ministry explicitly stated that they were planning to shift the balance away from ownership costs towards usage costs such as congestion pricing. And this policy statement was accompanied in the 2000s by quite a significant expansion of the electronic road pricing system. And every time the system was expanded, the same argument was used. The more we move towards usage-based restraints, the more we can allow people to own more cars. And there was even discussion back then about how the future road pricing system, which was already planned at that time to be satellite-based, would eventually give government the flexibility to charge users according to the marginal impact they caused on, congestion and road use. And this could even, for example, allow conversion of car ownership rights from a time-based right, because in the current system you can own a car for 10 years. Well, instead of that, why not, for example, have people own it based on a distance-based right? So I can use it for 100,000 kilometers or whatever it is. And that kilometer usage rate might actually depend on your marginal contribution to congestion. So there were a lot of policy ideas thrown about in the 2000s, but they all revolve around the same theme, which is ownership is not really the problem, usage is the problem. Therefore, the more I charge you for usage, the more ownership you can have. That's the idea. Okay, but we saw noticeable policy shift in the 2010s. And since the mid-2010s, there have been no more policy statements in Singapore that road pricing expansions will allow for expanded car ownership. In fact, the passenger car growth rate has been cut to 0% 2018, projected to remain at 0% through 2022. And part of the reason for these changes was actually the recognition that the continued growth in car ownership was actually not sustainable anymore, because there was starting to be more and more congestion outside the city center and key road areas. And at that point, I think policymakers felt that it was increasingly untenable to continue expanding road pricing, which was always a political pain point, as noted earlier. And this also came along with some significant missteps or failures in the public transport system, which led the government to start reinvesting into public transport. And ever since then, the land transport master plans which have been released have shifted very noticeably towards supporting this concept of car-lite urban mobility. So big increases in subsidies for public transit, new metro lines planned again, cycling infrastructure. But what all of this means is our policymakers no longer have this ability to sell the public expanded road pricing in exchange for more car ownership. So I think the political balance, how you introduce more complex, more advanced road pricing methods will be much, much more difficult in the years ahead in Singapore. Okay, so now I'm going to give a quick overview of the next generation global navigation satellite-based pricing system in Singapore. Okay, so planning began for this in the 2000s, led by the existing electronic road pricing system vendors. There was an 18-month system evaluation test in 2011. The tender was called in 2014, and it was awarded for about $500 million Singapore dollars to National Computer Systems and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Asia. And as of 2020, the installation of the vehicle-based units will begin next year. Full changeover is expected in 2023. However, at changeover, there is no plan for any change in the pricing system. In other words, the new system will replicate the existing system, except that it will no longer be based on short-range communications, it will be based on global satellite positioning. So how does the system work? This information is taken from the system vendor, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Land Transport Authority. So if you look on the left, that's the component architecture of the system. So the key elements we'll talk about are the onboard unit that you can see that on the right as well. It's basically a general purpose mobile computing device, much like your smartphone. Okay, and what it really does is it receives the satellite signal and it computes the charges based on the charging and location schedule that should be uploaded to it by the central computer system. Right. Besides the onboard unit, there's also a network of RSUs or roadside units, and that's very important. It's because the roadside units provide the capability to link the onboard units with the centralized computer system. And the roadside units also provide positioning services. Because it turns out in built-up areas, actually the satellite signals are not very precise. They're not good enough for road charging accuracy. So you need the roadside units to supplement the onboard navigation systems. Finally, you've got enforcement systems, but I don't think they're really that relevant for today's discussion. Okay, so there are some technical issues that I think we have to be aware of. The most important issue is that the satellite system doesn't work very well in built-up areas. There's a lot of reflection from tall buildings, but also in complex built-up areas where, for example, you've got underground roads, roads underneath flyovers, and so on, you lose signal all the time. That means that you have to supplement it with fixed infrastructure by the roadside, what they call RSUs. Okay. Second point is for charging, it turns out that it's a lot simpler to have the onboard units actually perform the charging calculations rather than a system where you have a centralized computer do all the charging and then send the charging information back and forth. So that's something else to consider because it means that the design and security requirements for the system have to be a bit higher than you might otherwise expect. You might not, for example, trust the system to be run of motorists' own handphones, which, there's always a possibility there that it could be manipulated and so on to avoid paying the correct charges. And then finally, on system cost issues, part of the reason why we embarked on this changeover to the GNSS-based system was because of the perception among policymakers that the existing system was very expensive to install and maintain. Okay, and that's partly because every time you want to expand the system, you have to build this fixed infrastructure. That's also because the infrastructure is proprietary. So you have a very limited set of vendors and to work with. Problem is, we do not actually know right now whether there is a substantial cost savings from switching over to satellite systems. Okay, first because in the built-up areas, the existing gantries have to be replaced by roadside unit infrastructure. So is that infrastructure cheaper than the gantries? That figure hasn't been released. And second, it's not clear that the new system actually uses open source technologies that would allow the government to have more choice in vendors and so on. That information also hasn't really been released. Finally, there's a bit of technology risk with these onboard units. Now, if you look at the picture of the onboard unit, a lot of motorists in Singapore have criticized it as looking like somebody's smartphone from the early 2010s. It's big and bulky, nobody really seems to like it. But when you install these systems, you're stuck with them for the next 10 years because they're expected to last the lifespan of the vehicle. And so the chance that your own mobile phone will have technological capabilities that far outstrip this unit will be incredibly large in the next couple of years. So that's a bit of an issue as well. And the government has already talked about the possibility of shifting over from onboard units provided by the government to just using motorists' own mobile devices. But again, it's not clear that accuracy can be maintained that way, and a lot more testing would have to be done for such a changeover. Okay. All right. So just very briefly, some other complications which come with this changeover. So in terms of the legislation, we have a Westminster parliamentary system. And as part of that, government prices, so this refers to any of your taxes, charges, fees, and so on, they can be specified either in primary, secondary legislation, or they're just left to regulatory discretion. But the key difference is this: when you put a charge or a tax in the primary law, you need a formal parliamentary vote. When you put it in subsidiary or secondary legislation, no problem, right? You can just publish it and change it anytime. And all our road pricing in Singapore is implemented in secondary legislation. So the government can change the prices and areas charged at any point in time. There's no need to get a vote from Parliament. However, it has to be published. And that publication requirement turns out to be a problem. It's a problem because when you have straightforward road pricing, it's no problem. You just write down in your legislation, I name these roads in the schedule, I name the set of prices and the set of times, that's it, it's law. But if I want to start publishing, for example, algorithm-driven pricing, which is more complex, for example, of the type that ride-hailing companies increasingly use or airlines use, I can't actually write that down in legislation, right? So there's going to be some need possibly to change legislation or the regulatory framework. And I think this is also going to be an issue in any parliamentary or democratic environment where there is a legislature or some kind of body which insists on seeing rules published in black and white or insists on having a vote, for example, on changes to these things. And that's something to be aware of. Okay. All right, so in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to go over some of the performance of our road pricing systems in practice and identify some challenges for future implementation or advancements in our road pricing systems. Okay, so first let me talk about our first road pricing system, the area licensing scheme in 1975. When this was implemented, the target was a 25% reduction in morning peak passenger car traffic. So the estimate back then was about 28,000 cars entered the central business district in the morning, 2 hours in the morning AM peak, and they were targeting about a 7,000 car reduction. Okay, so how was this implemented? Cars, any low occupancy passenger car under the scheme had to buy a day license, which cost $3 to enter the business district. There was also a parking surcharge imposed within the business district and bus lanes created. And Park and Ride was also created to facilitate motorists who wanted to change. So what happened after the scheme was implemented? Well, it turns out it was successful, but too successful. The general consensus of economists reviewing the scheme is that it was inefficient because it resulted in a far greater than expected reduction in car traffic. So passenger car traffic in the AM 2-hour peak actually fell by 76%. Okay, that's about 3 times as effective as they originally intended. And the result of this was a diversion of traffic to the shoulder periods, just before and just after the restricted hours, and also to roads around the central business district fringe. And there was also very little effect on congestion during the afternoon because it turned out all the cars came in anyway before or after the morning peak, or they found other ways to get around it. For example, there was also a bit of an increase in non-exempt vehicles. So some people were able to switch to trucks or what have you instead of driving passenger cars. Okay. So despite this, for the next 20 or so years that the area licensing scheme was in operation, the government actually doubled down on it rather than scale it back a bit. Although all the economists were claiming that there was too much road traffic reduction. So the vehicle reductions, the vehicle exemptions for anything which wasn't a passenger car, those were gradually removed. The park and ride facilities and subsidies were taken out. Whole day pricing was introduced with shoulder pricing, where you charge more during the morning and afternoon peak, and you charge less if you want to enter only during the middle of the day. But after a while, the government started having so many different kinds of licenses, for depending your type of car, the time of day, which road you wanted to use, and so on, that it was pretty clear you needed a more automatic system than the area licensing scheme, because the way it worked was you bought this sticker, you put it in your car windshield, and people had to verify that you actually had the correct sticker. So that's the impetus behind development for electronic road pricing. Okay, so what is the electronic road pricing setting policy? The rates are revised quarterly And the intent is to actually maintain traffic flows at levels of service D and E. So you can see the speed flow chart for Singapore roads, expressways on the right-hand side, and levels of service D and E, that's basically around maximum throughput of the road. That means a speed of 45 to 65 kilometers per hour on expressways, 20 to 30 kilometers per hour on CBD and arterial roads. Now, the rate setting is actually iterative. That means that we set rates every quarter, we see whether it works or not. And if we see that traffic conditions deteriorate, so they start going, towards E and maybe a bit towards F, then the rates are actually just raised progressively the next quarter. That's the policy that we follow. Now, this seems maybe a bit ad hoc, but actually Lee 2002 argues that tolling based on this kind of traffic flow targeting actually approximates the theoretical optimal toll charge, which normally requires estimation of the underlying demand function. But policymakers in Singapore don't need to do that. They just target the levels of service D and E, and that's what they get. Okay. And the electronic road pricing system is actually very effective in maintaining road speeds in Singapore. On the left-hand side, we've got the average road speeds during the morning and evening peak on expressways in blue, CBD and arterial roads in red. And you've got vehicle population on black in the middle. So you can see that despite a massive increase in vehicle population in the mid-2000s, traffic speeds have been maintained pretty much at the same level on our major roads, because when necessary, the road prices simply go up, right, to maintain speeds at the ideal level, which is about mid-60. In fact, they've been maintained at the upper end of the speed bands indicated earlier. On the right-hand side, you've got a demonstration of what happens at a micro level at a particular gantry. And the black line shows you the traffic flows before introduction or hiking of road pricing rates at this gantry. And the line below that, the dotted, line below that shows a simulation and the results after the prices go in. And what happens if we employ this shoulder pricing method, where the prices go up progressively the closer to the peak of the peak you get. And the effect is really to spread out the traffic throughout the peak period, as well as to the shoulders just before and after the peak period. Okay, so in theory, our pricing system only targets optimal traffic flow. In practice, policymakers have been quite flexible based on political considerations. So what are examples of this? In 2005, road pricing was extended to charge motorists for homebound peak hour trips. So in the evening when you're going home on the expressway. As you can imagine, people were not happy with this, right? People were asking, why are you charging me to go home? And so policymakers responded by announcing that the policy of targeting prices and speeds would be given greater flexibility for evening outbound trips. And this is the same as saying that policymakers agree the value of time or reliability can be much lower for evening trips. Right? They're willing to tolerate much more deterioration in road traffic speeds before triggering an increase in evening homebound trips compared to morning city-bound trips. So that's one point. Okay. Second point, road pricing was extended in 2005 to include the shopping district, which is next to the central business district. And this created a lot of opposition from retailers located there. And policymakers went to great lengths to try to prove that the pricing mostly deterred through traffic through the shopping zone rather than shopping bound traffic. Okay, but it's unclear whether this is actually supported by the data. There is a paper by Agarwal et al. Which finds that price hikes of the road pricing system appear to actually reduce retail property values. They have no effect, however, on residential or commercial property values. So this is a bit unclear. Okay, just a quick overview of prices and finances in perspective. Second last slide, sorry. Okay, road user charges have actually continuously declined in real terms since 1975. They started out at about being $3 in then Singapore dollars in 1975, went up to $5, and then went back to $3 when electronic pricing was introduced. But because because of economic progress and inflation, actually the real price of road pricing has been on a downward trend continuously, right? It was something like about almost $10 in 2019 back in 1980, but now it's still only about $3 to $4. And because real per capita GDP today is 6 times higher than in 1975, you can see that it's never been cheaper or more affordable for people to actually pay these road user charges. And in fact, road user charges form a drop in the bucket of vehicle-related revenue for the government. The ERP system generates about 150 million a year in the early 2010s. It actually used to generate less than the former area licensing scheme. But guess what? Vehicle ownership taxes generated $2.5 billion in 2018. Quota premiums generated $3.6 billion. So vehicle taxes and premiums, not counting road pricing, that actually forms about 8.5% of government operating revenue. Okay, so it's a huge boost to the coffer in Singapore. Okay, so final slide. What are some of the issues we have to contend with as we go to the next generation system? First, the next generation system enables distance-based pricing to be implemented. Problem is we don't know much right now about how regular motorists respond to distance charges. I and some co-authors conducted behavioral experiments in 2013, and the objective was to test whether motorists respond differently to the same charge depending on whether you're told it's a charge for passing a certain point or a charge for driving a certain distance. And what we found is motorists actually perceive a point-based toll, for example, $2 to drive on 2 kilometers of a toll expressway. They find it to be psychologically more costly than telling them the same charge, but specified as, for example, 10 cents per 100 meters. Okay, so perhaps the way you communicate charges actually matters. And this is important because the new onboard units provide policymakers with the scope to guide motorists through offering different price alternatives. For example, if you knew that the motorist was always going to go to the CBD in the morning, you could tell the motorist in the morning, if you take route A, it's going to cost you this amount. If you take route B, it's going to cost you this amount instead. These are the travel times and so on. And that's important because I think it guides motorists along routes which might be optimal from the point of view of the system and also gives people alternatives. There's some research that's been conducted on how the OBU interface affects motorists, but it's unclear whether these tests have included pricing. And I've talked to people at the authority, and it doesn't seem that anybody's actually done any field tests with real motorists, to see whether people respond differently under different charging regimes right now. My experiments in the early 2010s were lab-based. What are the welfare effects of the system? Very little research has been done on this in recent years. Early studies in the area licensing scheme, and those were a bit skeptical, and some of them found that the welfare effects might be negative because of the underutilization of the charge roads. So in general, a lot more research is needed. Not a lot of data is released on the road pricing system, but I'm hopeful that as we start to change over to the new system and there's more interest in thinking of new policy alternatives and options for charging, there will be a bit of a renaissance in this kind of research. Okay, so that's all for my presentation. Thank you.